First heading, Lazarus' death, what the bereaved thought about it. I was thrilled when I heard that my friend Dave had become a Christian. He was a year or two younger than I was, and he went to the same school that I did, and was also a member of the same Venture Scout group that I was. Venture Scouts, by the way, are members of the Boy Scout movement, but who are a bit older. They're over 16, usually. And we spent many Saturdays, he and I, on either end of the same climbing rope, sometimes in the Lake District and sometimes in Northumberland. And Northumberland was a bit easier to get to if you lived in Sunderland, as we did at that time. And at intervals, I tried to share the gospel with him. He wasn't a Christian yet, as I was at the time. And soon after, we both went to university. He went to Swansea in South Wales. And well, he was converted, which was marvellous. And when I heard that, I introduced him to a Bible reading course, which is still available, actually. You can still buy it. It's called Search the Scriptures, and it gets you through the entire Scriptures within 3 years if you keep it up. And when he came to John chapter 11, the passage that we read just now, he told me that he couldn't put it down. Why? Well, because he'd no idea how the story ended. He wanted to find out what happened to Lazarus. 4 decades have rolled on since that time. That was in the early 1970s. Well, it's probably slightly more than 4 decades, actually. And there must be even more young people now who don't know what became of Lazarus. They've not been brought up with any idea of the Bible, with any idea of the New Testament record. And when some people hear about Lazarus and his story, they simply refuse to believe it. They try to explain away the miracle by suggesting that Lazarus must just have been very ill and that Jesus brought a very sick man back to health and strength. Well, that won't stand up to examination, I'm afraid. And all the circumstantial detail tells us that Lazarus actually was as dead as a doornail. First of all, when Jewish people died in the first century, their bodies were anointed with spices, covered all over with spices, myrrh and aloes and other such things. And those who did the anointing covered the entire body of the deceased with these spices. So if there'd been the least flicker of life, those who were laying out the corpse would have noticed whether there was any flicker of life there. Now, also, Lazarus, by the time Jesus got to him, had been dead for 4 days by the time Jesus arrived. Verse 39. So when Jesus asked for the stone that sealed the mouth of the tomb to be taken away, Lazarus' sister Martha could not understand his request. There's already a strong smell, she told Jesus. Putrefaction, you see, would have set in. Nothing more could be done. That was the point she was trying to make. The corpse was already decomposing. Now, we should also note that the two sisters of Lazarus, Martha and Mary, were both in a wistful mood. Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. That point's made in both verse 21 and verse 32. And these words were not intended as a rebuke along the lines of, why didn't you get here sooner? They're an expression of simple regret, really. They knew that Jesus could heal the sick. They'd seen that done on many different occasions. If he'd only arrived while Lazarus was still just breathing, while there was still some flicker of life in him, well, there might have been grounds for optimism. Once a man has died, though, he's beyond rescue, isn't he? That was the usual logic that applied in such cases. And some of the mourners obviously felt the same way. You can see that in verse 37. Could not this man, who opened the eyes of the blind, they'd seen that done earlier in this gospel, also have kept this man from dying? That's the way they were thinking. If he'd got there that bit sooner. Well, at this point in the unfolding story, Jesus was in tears. Verse 35. Now, in one sense, the onlookers drew the right conclusion from the fact that Jesus wept. He really did care for his friend, thought the world of him. They made the mistake, though, of supposing that Jesus' tears were a sign of frustration, as though Jesus was in torment because he'd not come in time to heal the sick man, and that death had intervened and death had got the better of Jesus. It's almost as though they felt sorry for Jesus, as though they were thinking like this: for all your mighty powers, this one has slipped through your fingers. A miracle cure might pull a dying man back from the brink. But once a man is dead, he's dead, and that's the end. Bereaved relatives, sympathetic bystanders, they were all certain that Lazarus was dead as dead could be. Jesus, they felt, was as helpless in the face of death as anyone else. And that was that. That's the way they'd worked it out. 2,000 years later, we're no better off. That's the way most people think. This is one monster that we are powerless to face. We whistle in the dark. We push it all to the back of our minds and pretend it will go away. But death is mocking us from the shadows. Towards the very end of my time as pastor at the church at Lancaster, I had occasion to attend what called itself a humanist funeral. Many of you will remember a man just a little bit younger than me from the church at Lancaster, a man named Stephen Walker, and one of his relations had died, and the family, not Stephen Walker's family, but close relatives, had wanted a humanist funeral. It is the bleakest funeral I have ever attended. I mean, the celebrant, as he called himself, said nice things about the person who died, the kind of life he'd lived, and what relations wanted to have said about him, but no hope for the future, no hope. Where was he going to go when he died? What could be said about what he was going to face in the world to come? Was there a world to come? Nothing, nothing, nothing. Well, they were all whistling in the dark, peering over the edge. Now, every so often, a new experience triggers it all off again. It's as though a skeleton had stepped out of the shadows and poked us in the chest with its bony finger and said, "You won't escape me, you know. I'm still here. And sooner or later they all come to me." Do you remember that time you were travelling down the motorway and saw an ambulance or a fire engine and the tangled wreckage of the car crash? So you had a sharp intake of breath and you thought, oh. Does it make you think, those occasions when such things happen? And then the scriptures, do not boast about tomorrow. You don't know what a day may bring forth. At every turn, the grim reaper drops hints and reminders that one day he will come calling for you, for me. Man who's born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. He comes forth like a flower and fades away. He flees like a shadow and doesn't continue. We've arrived, friends, at the ultimate test. It's as though planet Earth is like a giant morgue on its journey through space. A colossal cemetery. And death is certain. Death is unavoidable. No religion, no philosophy, no worldview is worth twopence unless it can prove itself at an open grave. Is it? No Messiah is worth following unless he can offer solid hope beside an open grave. And this was Jesus' sternest test yet, because there he was beside a grave. And what could he say to people beside an open grave? So this brings me immediately to my second heading, Lazarus' death, what Jesus thought about it. Now, Jesus thought the world of Lazarus, and the disciples asked him to go to Lazarus by saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. That's verse 3. But nevertheless, there's more to this story than the life or the death of just one man. Lazarus became a kind of test case and a declaration of intent. He became an opportunity for Jesus to serve notice to the whole human race, to the whole race of angels and demons, and even to death itself, because Jesus had come to take up a challenge. At the very dawn of time, the representative of the whole human race had failed. Had failed the test. And in doing so, he brought death upon the human race. You know the way that the Apostle Paul had put it? And there's a key statement about that death came upon all mankind because one man had sinned. Well, there's a marvelous thought here that a new champion for humanity had entered the fray. A couple of statements for us here in the passage that give us a helpful clue as to what was going on in Jesus' mind. In verse 35, we've got the shortest passage in the Bible. Jesus wept. Now, what does this mean? Well, it actually means not simply that we've got a single tear trickling down Jesus' cheek. It means Jesus burst into tears. As though, it's almost as though a torrent was pouring down his face. Very intense indeed. You see, Jesus looked around and he could see the mourners, the wailing women, the professional mourners who had been hired for the occasion, was the custom of the day. And it's as though Jesus stood symbolically at every grave that there ever was. And Jesus could see his people, his human people, all the people that he loved throughout eternity. And he could see what death had done to the people that he loved. It's as though Jesus was symbolically standing at every graveside that there had ever been. And his tears were not just for Lazarus. His tears were for you and me. Every time we've ever been at a graveside. The Son of God did not weep in the way that you or I might at the death of a dear friend. And not just as we do out of a sense of loss, you know. Oh, I'm going to miss him so much. When we think, when we're at a graveside and we're so concerned by a sense of that deep, biting sense of loss, I'm never going to see him again, never going to see her again. Well, Jesus wept for his people who were the dupes of evil and sin. Jesus wept because these people were so blind, because they couldn't see him, Jesus Christ, for who and what he is. He wept because they'd chosen a road that was too hard to walk on. He wept in sorrow, and he wept in fellow feeling for these helpless mites caught up in the crossfire of a war that Satan had waged on heaven. Now, secondly, in verse 33, we're also told something about Jesus, that he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Now, it would be easy to imagine from this that Jesus, like the rest of them there, was deeply upset at the loss of his friend. But the Greek word that's translated groaned is a very strong word, and it usually indicated the snorting of horses. It's very meaningful, and when that same Greek word is used of people, it usually indicated extraordinary depth of emotion. It indicates an element of sympathy, but yes, the dominant mode is anger. Like the farmer in Jesus' parable. Do you remember the parable of the wheat and the tares? And the farmer looked out on his field and he said, "An enemy has done this. An enemy has done this." Now think about that. Jesus, looking at Lazarus' grave, groaned in spirit, and he recognized the handiwork of an old foe. Why is the world full of graves? Why is the world full of cemeteries? Well, it's all because a powerful evil spirit named Satan came into our world, determined to turn every truth into a lie, to twist and stunt and disrupt the harmony of God's good creation. And when God first made human beings, it was not his intention that we should die. But the malice of Satan in inducing our very first parents to sin has meant that death spread to all men because all have sinned. And at one funeral after another, there's a spectator at every funeral that we can't see. Think about it. That spectator is sniggering and gloating at yet another triumph. He's pleased with all the havoc that he has caused at one funeral after another, and loved ones mourn with sorrow at the passing of their loved ones, their mother, their father, their wife, their husband. But Satan is laughing. Think about it. Now, by contrast, though, at Lazarus' grave, see the God-man, moved to the very core with holy wrath. And here is no bereaved relative stunned into impetus, thinking to himself, there's nothing we can do. This is the moment where we are completely helpless. He came to that graveside as heaven's champion. Through the 3 short years of his public ministry, he'd met one test after another, and every time he triumphed. He'd silenced the storm on the lake. He'd fed the hungry in their thousands. He met disease and sickness of every kind, and no challenge had proved too great for him. He'd gone from one daunting obstacle to another, marching and conquering, more than a match for Satan and all the damage he'd brought upon our world. And now he was faced with a corpse. What would he do? Look at him. Every fibre of his being alight with intense but controlled anger at sin and death and the devil. And everyone watching must know, and heaven must know, and even hell must know, this state of affairs cannot be allowed to continue. And there was only one thing he could do. And the king, the royal warrior, spoke. Lazarus, come out. The Greek actually means Lazarus, here, outside. And out he came, the man who had been dead and rotten, in rude good health. Now here's a little addition to the story. In roughly 1840, in the East Midlands, in an English school, the school teacher was telling this story to her class, and she then put a question. Why is it that the Lord Jesus Christ didn't just say, come forth? Why did he say, Lazarus, come forth? Now, that was a rather precocious schoolboy. His name was Charles. He was rather chunky in build. Wasn't tall, but very stocky. He put up his hand. So she allowed him to answer the question. Yes, Charlie, she said. What's the answer? And he said, well, miss, it's because if he hadn't said, Lazarus, come forth, but if he just said, come forth, the whole graveyard would have emptied. And they'd all have come out. Had that ever occurred to you? The boy's name, by the way, was Charles Spurgeon. That's a great story, isn't it? Doesn't it just make you tingle to think of the man he became? And every time you see a group of children at a church, that one day one of them might yet be a Charles Spurgeon. It's possible, you know. Now, where does the sign point? That's our next heading. We're not quite done. Put up with me for a bit longer, eh? This incident is not isolated, friends. We know of 3 other cases where dead people were brought to life by Jesus. Peter's mother, the widow of Nain's son, and Jairus' daughter. And there's also a disturbing and unsettling incident that occurred at the time of Jesus' death. Behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. That itself is odd. Normally, if you're going to tear a curtain, you'd start at the bottom and create a nick and then begin tearing it, but it happened from the top. And that particular curtain was about 20 feet high, you know. And the earth quaked, and the rocks were split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who'd fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. Boy, that must have created a sensation. The people going about their ordinary business, living out their ordinary lives in Jerusalem, and suddenly people who'd been buried a while started appearing to them. That would be enough to make anybody stop and think, wouldn't it? And most emphatic of all is the sober fact that Jesus died himself, but on the third day the angel said, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" The God-man, as dead as ever Lazarus had been, erupted out of his own tomb in the power of an endless life. Satan played his trump card, but an all-conquering Jesus brushed aside this last obstacle to his royal triumph. Do you realize who you're dealing with in Jesus? Note how he described himself to Martha. I'm the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. That's you. I'm talking to you. You believe in Jesus? Though you may die, I might go to your funeral, you know. I doubt it. You are more likely to attend mine. I hope you will. I don't think I've got much longer. It would be nice if you showed up. Just let the enormity of this sink in. Jesus insisted that he is the very source of life, the origin of life. It starts with him. He created it all. So he has power over death, and those who entrust themselves to him, for all that they're quite likely to die unless he shows up first for his second coming, they'll not remain dead, but rise with him to a new kind of life altogether. Now, normally, people who say that kind of thing are either very wicked, you know, the kind of charlatans who get put away in prison, or the kind of people who head up extreme cults for the sake of money or for the sake of the kind of power they can gain over people. But not Jesus, surely. He was such a good man. So wonderfully upright, so wonderfully selfless, and the sanest man who ever lived. Perhaps the only sane person in a world gone mad. And this man raised the dead, didn't he? He really did. And in all likelihood, he raised dead people on more than the 4 occasions that are definitely reckoned in the Bible. Consider his words of reassurance to John the Baptist. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up. Now he said that, the dead are raised up, as if to suggest that it was going on reasonably frequently. There's a wonderful exuberance about Jesus, you know. He's like a mountain river in spate, vibrant and free, gushing and vital. Life itself, unfettered, unbound, unchained, flows from Jesus. And this life is so forceful and abundant that even death can't quench it. No. I could go on forever. I don't want to be unkind to you. You've been good, you've turned up, you've listened to me for a while now. I'd better stop. Let's sing again. 854, forever.